There's certainly a planning process, and that involves identifying goals, collecting and analyzing data and existing conditions, and then forming recommendations. And I think it is very important to know what the process is in your township, in your community, and follow it. Because if you don't follow the established code and the planning process, that will be used against people who are interested in planning by the interests on the other side. So you want to work with your planning, your local resources in the township administration. It could be a codes officer, it could be a planning person, it could be the town manager, it could be all those people. And involving them and trying to work together with them really is the best way to go about things, to make sure you're following all the proper procedures. Ultimately, when you get through that, then you would get to plan adoption and acceptance as official policy. And I think there's a lot of steps along the way. I know here in East Whiteland, we've had changes in our code, which happen without regard to history. And specifically, for many years, we had a piece of our code that referred to demolition by neglect. And that was taken out of our code without the knowledge of the Historical Commission. And it took us a number of years, first of all, to realize it wasn't in the code because no one told us about it. But then to go and get that code section put back in was somewhat of a lengthy process. It wasn't as easy as having the supervisors vote to take it out. Ultimately, we were successful in getting that piece of the code put back in, but it's not a magic bullet. At the time that we did that, our own solicitor told us that it was unenforceable. So notwithstanding that, our supervisors voted to put it back in. And again, it just highlights the different things you need to navigate in terms of process, and every situation has some unique aspect that is outside of the standard, but understanding the standard process and following the standard procedures is certainly the way to start out, which gives you a basis to move forward. And ultimately, implementation would involve having supervisors approve something. So what are some of the considerations? And I've talked about this a little bit earlier. Okay, here comes Jeannine. Maybe Jeannine can, let's see if I can.
Hello,
okay.
everybody.
Hello. Hi, Jeannine, welcome.
I kept getting logged on for some reason. I want to apologize to everybody. I kept getting logged on as an attendee, and people could see me in the attendees list, but they couldn't see me as a panelist.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what was happening. Something went wonky with Zoom, and I just want to apologize to everybody.
Sure.
For that.
Jeannine, I can do the slides for you. You just tell me you want to start at the beginning, and you can start your presentation from there. Or you want to start from here? What do you want to do?
Is it going to be a problem if I start at the beginning?
No, not at all.
I don't want to keep people because now it's going to mess up your program. I'll try to speak quickly.
Okay. Yeah, we'll just do it on, and I'll do the slides for you. So you can tell me when you want to go next.
I got on at 9 o'clock to try to be early too.
Okay.
Okay, everybody. I'm Jeannine Speirs. Thank you so much for having me to the Historic Preservation Network. I'm just going to move on and start my talk. So historic and cultural resources are really integral parts of community identity and sense of place, and as such, foundational to planning for a community's future. Very briefly, Chester County's comprehensive plan, which I heard Tim talking about and Jim also spoke about, Landscapes 3, it discusses balancing preservation and growth, including taking stock of communities' resources and planning for the future. And it encourages, and this is important in the theme of the webinar today, it encourages retention of sense of place and cultural and historic resources as an inherent part of this. So Landscapes 3 has 3 resource protection oriented goal areas, and that's appreciate for historic resources, preserve and protect for open space and for natural resources. And together, all three of these goal areas look at the future based on existing features, meaning in a site responsive manner, looking at the existing features on a site first and then going from there for what's going to happen to that site. Is the, I guess, the aspirational goal of Landscapes 3 and how the policy and the recommendations are also drafted. So as Tim already started, today I'm discussing two cultural and historic resource preservation tools. There's the planning process to develop policy. And then we're still on slide 1, Tim.
Okay, sorry.
I'll say when it's slide 2.
Okay.
And then there is the protection standards through adopted regulations, and that is just one way to implement planning policy. You'll see on the bottom of each slide, there are web links that you can copy down, and both of those web links provide more information for each of these tools on Chester County Planning Commission's website. Both cultural and historic resources planning and protection are really key local planning goals in guiding, as I was saying, a site responsive future and in light of change, which of course change is one of the only constants and inevitable. But these two tools take into account existing features, including those grounded in cultural heritage. So as I'm speaking today, please keep in mind the themes of the full workshop: why old places matter, and celebrating our cultural heritage. And I'll be working to interweave into my discussion these two overall themes into both of these planning tools I'm talking about. Both of these tools, I want to mention as a caveat, are geared to municipal planning and specifically to municipal historical commissions. So I will be speaking in this context, and my talk will be a bit technical at times. You're seeing from the slide what I'm going to discuss for each tool. And again, one tool is the planning and one tool is the protection standards, AKA regulations. How does each work? What is each? How does each work? What are the benefits? How to get started? And what are some considerations? Next slide, please. So who cares? Why do preservation planning? Well, people care. And whether it's conscious or not, people do value historic and cultural resources, setting, and landscapes in their communities. And why they value those is because these features, they provide a visual link to a community's evolution. They evoke a sense of place and identity. They provide individualized community character. And last but not least, in the case of historic buildings, they display irreplaceable built elements that really can't be produced or would not be reproduced today. Cultural and historic resources can sometimes, unfortunately, be treated as throwaway items as needed in light of other seemingly more glamorous or perceived more important goals. But both cultural and historic resources are, as I said before, often unconsciously really an inherent part of a community, something that you wouldn't even necessarily see as you walk or drive by every day, but once they're missing, it's very noticeable that suddenly your community character has changed. And really rooted in the community character, the community identity, and not only, its sense of place, but also a community's quality of place. Next slide, please. So preservation planning is more than reciting a short history of what the community is or isn't and what the history has been. It's an input process for the community to identify its cultural and historic resource preservation goals and policies and strategies to achieve those goals. Preservation planning, unfortunately, often begins too late in the process. For example, after a beloved building is proposed for demolition. And when this happens too late in the process, it leads to perceptions that preservation planning is an impediment or anti-change, but that's not what it is. And that is a false perception. Reactive planning that leads to these false perceptions can be curtailed with thoughtful and established preservation policy in place. So how does preservation planning work? Well, there is a legislation at the state level called the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code. And again, it's called the State Enabling Legislation, and it enables all municipal planning, of which historic resource planning is a portion. In Pennsylvania, in following the spirit of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, the Pennsylvania Code the Pennsylvania Constitution, the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code requires, as one of several basic municipal comprehensive planning elements, to have a plan for historic resources. A comprehensive plan is, as the name suggests, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a municipal plan that focuses on various aspects of local planning, whether it be historic resources, land use, community facilities, etc. But historic resources is definitely one item that's called out in the municipalities planning code, so it's not an afterthought. The municipalities planning code can be treated as a jumping off point to create the foundation and secure the legitimacy, and legitimacy is an important word here, for historic resource planning locally. But really, for successful preservation planning, the municipalities planning code shouldn't be considered the be-all end-all, or it shouldn't be, resource planning using the municipalities planning code shouldn't be done just to fulfill a checkbox and say, you know, we've done it, we've looked at historic resources, move on with other glamorous stuff, as I was saying before. The MPC also importantly legitimizes historic resource surveys in requiring them as part of comprehensive planning. And historic resources are also considered in other facets of the MPC, for example, in looking at multi-municipal planning, regional planning, cooperative planning, easements, and other items. So historic resources really are scattered throughout the MPC, and the legitimacy for planning for them and their preservation and protection in a municipality is grounded in the municipalities planning code, and it is a legitimate local planning tool. The outcome of this planning can take different forms and in different types of landscape settings. For example, a borough might be an urban setting. You might have a suburban area, a suburban center such as Exton. You could have a rural area, like large portions of southern Chester County, or you could have an agricultural area, like large portions of western and northern Chester County. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits of historic preservation planning? Well, there's many, and I'm just going to really quickly review a couple. One is shared goals. Historic and cultural resource planning, again, is a process to establish a community's understanding of its preservation goals, but importantly, how do those preservation goals fit with all your other goals? How does it fit for your plans for sewer? How does it fit for your municipal plans for water or for future land use? It's important that historic and cultural resources, the buildings themselves, the landscapes and the settings are considered in that context so that they are right at the ground floor, at the table, so to speak, at the beginning conversations, and again, not an afterthought to have later reactive planning that then is perceived in a negative way. An example of a shared goal might be smart growth, reusing the existing built environment, reducing new land consumption. Energy conservation is another example of a shared goal. Continued use of existing structures and their materials. And economic development is a third example of a shared local planning goal. For example, heritage interpretive tourism. Other items that are beneficial, obviously, are protecting the resource itself. Importantly, preservation planning applies a systematic approach to develop policies and implementation strategies. So you have justification in going through this systematic approach for why you're doing what you're doing and how you came to those conclusions. Importantly, it provides a community an awareness of its sense of self. The whole process of preservation planning imparts a greater conscious, and I'm going to use that word as well, keep using that, awareness of historic and cultural resources and their contribution to a community's character, sense of identity, and quality of place. And also it provides clarification. There's some misinformation out there about what historic resource planning is or isn't, what it can and can't do. And this conversation through a structured approach to preservation planning and creating a preservation plan as the end goal really starts to talk about what preservation planning is or isn't, and hopefully avoids misinformation and potentially opposition to preservation planning simply due to misinformation. Next slide, please. So getting started in considerations while you undertake a planning process. Very briefly, a planning process is Goal identification, data collection. In this case, that data collection is identifying your cultural and historic resources, as well as, importantly, federal, state, and state preservation policy and law, which the basis of preservation, at least at the higher tiers, the 30,000 foot level, is grounded in. Then, of course, you do your resource analysis, you do your strategy formation, and then implementation, aka resource protection standards that I'm going to discuss next. In terms of identifying resources, just very quickly, because this is sometimes a confusing item, historic resources generally are building, sites, structures, objects, and areas, meaning districts, that are 50 years and older. There's various ways to identify them. National Register listed and eligible is an obvious way to identify them. There's also other sorts of ways to identify them. For example, the survey that I mentioned earlier in my presentation that the municipality's planning code legitimizes, and then also criteria, naming criteria for how you identify what is, let's say, an old building and what is a historic resource. And there's also different levels of resource identification depending on what function you're using that resource identification for. For example, is the resource identification for research? Is it to do a holistic identification for maybe your municipal comprehensive plan? Or is it resource identification to really vet a very specific list for which resources should be regulated through resource protection? I want to say that cultural resource planning also is sometimes taken out of the loop in favor of just looking at the buildings themselves. The cultural resource planning is important because it inherently ties the historic resource, generally speaking, the building, into the setting and the context. And this also includes looking at sociocultural attributes and physical environmental intersection. For example, the cultural use of a building. Maybe not the building's architecture, but the cultural use of the building may be important and why it's an important community asset. The building's role in the community, for example, as a local landmark, the building or the site's social affiliation. It's really about the intersection of human history, and I think this gets back to some of what Tom was talking about earlier in his presentation, first presentation of today, the intersection of human history, the interdependence with the land, and how cultural changes over time, and how that building and resource intersect with those three different items. So community engagement is a very important part of resource planning. Fostering community participation, which can sometimes be scary because it's the unknown. You don't know what you're going to get. You don't know if you're going to be yelled at. You don't know if you're going to be smiled at. But it's very important to hear from the community, and it is absolutely key for successful preservation policy development because it brings out concerns, it creates awareness, it builds consensus, it can identify and resolve potential policy conflicts also with other municipal policies, and it can also identify possible conflicts such as private property rights discussion. It's best to get those conversations out at the beginning and while you're in the planning process and not have them be surprise discussions later when you're trying to figure out how to preserve individual historic resource or site. Also, it's important to take into account the landscapes, as I was talking about, and I want to emphasize this, around the historic resource. For example, open space lands that provide the context for a building and setting, and John Snook's going to be talking about this a little bit later, or the historic landscape that actually is a resource in and of itself. So tying things together, successful preservation planning clearly shows the inherent link of these historic and cultural resources, settings, and landscapes with community identity and character. Tying things together as well is a consideration. It can really help a municipality ensure historic and cultural resources and landscapes are considered during the general community planning and development decision-making process, aka bringing historic and cultural resources to the table at the get-go as a base for site-responsive development and not as a later afterthought. So some quick examples of what type of form a preservation plan could take. As I was saying, under the municipality's planning code, it could be part of a comprehensive plan, a municipal comprehensive plan. It could be a chapter in that plan or a focus area in that plan. It could also be a freestanding plan. For example, Westchester Borough does have a freestanding historic preservation plan. It could be a specific plan. Jim Garrison had mentioned that I've been part of the Brandywine Battlefield, or leading the Brandywine Battlefield preservation planning and study. And we have done specific plans for portions of the battlefield to talk about various preservation topics. It could be related types of plans. For example, a village master plan is also often inherently tied to resource preservation. You could also have economic development plans, revitalization plans, and heritage interpretation plans. And those are all other ways to talk about historic resource preservation in different facets. You could have a strategic plan of action, or you could have something like Valley Forge National Historic Park, where you have this cultural landscape protected by many years of preservation planning at the federal level. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. So moving on to the next tool now, the Historic Resource Protection Standards. And I have listed on the slide, AKA, this is one type, not the only type of implementation approach, but this is one type of implementation approach to implement all of this wonderful policy that you just created using the last tool, historic and cultural resources planning. So what is this one tool? This tool is the resource protection standards that are adopted by ordinance. So it is an ordinance sort of tool. And why you would do this is because, well, we've established now in looking at policy that historic resources are indeed valued, inherent elements of community character. Their protection and their continuation into the future is often not guaranteed. So historic resource protection standards, and I'll repeat again, they are municipal regulatory measures. They protect historic buildings, structures. They can protect neighborhoods and landscapes from demolition, alteration, and incompatible development. And also think of them as a way to maintain historic resources as really continuing cornerstones of community identity and sense of place within the evolving cultural landscape that are all of our communities. So how does it work? Well, as I said, it supports the municipal historic resource and cultural resource planning and policies that was discussed earlier. Regulations can vary depending on what those goals and the policy that was established was. For example, you have to look at historic resource types, you have to look at their contents. Again, you have to look at your local policy. You have to look at the community climate in general towards preservation. But in Pennsylvania, there's two major types of preservation protection. And the first one is the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code, which I've already mentioned. So it addresses historic resource preservation protection in several areas. The intents of the Municipalities Planning Code, right there, and the intents of the whole municipality, the whole enabling legislation addresses promoting preservation of historic resources, including, for example, guiding and protecting cultural facilities and guiding development and growth. It goes on to say that zoning may regulate size, bulk, construction, repair, alteration, raising, and uses of structures. And key is zoning is required to have historic resource and features protection. And that's a requirement, a mandate. So the regulations through this process are administered by the municipality at the municipal level, and often with the advisory assistance of a municipal historical commission. And that historical commission would be created by another type of enabling legislation at the state level called the Township or Borough Code. The second major type of historic resource protection standards in Pennsylvania is called the Local Historic District Act. And it addresses protecting historic character in designated local historic districts, which both can be compact areas, for example, maybe a town center, or could be a large rural thematic area, let's say a large agricultural area that is connected by the historic agricultural theme. Its focus is a little bit different, focuses on existing structures and new construction. It focuses on both contributing and non-contributing elements to these districts that have been established. And all these elements are taken into some level of account to maintain district character. Whether they're contributing or not contributing, they're still at least taken under some level of consideration. Contributing elements to the district, meaning elements, whether it's buildings or other features that play a specific role in making that district what it is as historic, obviously those would have a different level of review and consideration than other features that don't contribute to making the district historic for the reasons it's historic. I want to emphasize that it's very important because it's often incorrectly associated that this type of protection, the Local Historic District Act, requires strict architectural standards and aesthetic design. For example, everybody talks about color limitations or shutters. But the enabling legislation is really written broadly and does allow flexibility and latitude in structuring local regulations appropriate to an individual municipality. So I wanted to make sure everybody heard that, because that is a misconception that is rampant, and the regulations simply don't have to be used in that form if it doesn't meet municipal policy. These types of regulations, they're certified by the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission. They're developed and administered at the local level by the municipality, and with the assistance of not a historical commission, but an historic architectural review board, which is slightly different than a historical commission. I want to note between these two sets of major regulations that I've just summarized in a couple minutes, the MPC regulations, they largely focus on community character as your takeaway. You can think they largely focus on community character and land use oriented protection standards, for example, area and bulk, those types of regulations. And then you can think of the 167, the local historic district regulations. They largely focus on protecting very specific physical aspects of the historic built environment in a specific designed area, sort of as the general takeaway for how these two regulation enabling legislations work and how they do and don't interact with one another. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits of any type of historic resource protection standards, aka regulations? Well, obviously, they protect the historic resources themselves and the community character. Getting back to the theme of this whole webinar, they can protect neighborhood vitality. You have continued use of these buildings, including property maintenance and rehabilitation of otherwise potentially unused structures that could be problematic to a neighborhood overall if they're left unused. As I said before, in policy making, as well as in protection standards, this contributes to energy conservation and smart growth. You're reusing the existing building stock and infrastructure. Economic value. There's been historic resources studies that have shown to increase property values, and further so when historic settings and landscapes are also preserved and maintained. There's also possible tax credits for rehabilitation and business improvement districts. For example, the Westchester Business Improvement District is very well known to have done this, use the historic resources as a core element in marketing their downtowns, because these historic resources make the place unique and special and have its own identity. And that really feeds right into a marketing plan, which a marketing plan, of course, is always looking for something that's unique, special, different to market whatever the product is. And here you have, bingo, you have historic and cultural resources that are sitting right there that can be used for that economic purpose. From an environmental perspective, rehabilitating, preserving historic resource, you can remediate potential contaminants. And you can prevent demolition and debris material directed into landfills. And also, it's the continued use from an environmental perspective, and getting back to energy conservation, also the continued use of energy that's already embodied in existing development that went into the construction of these buildings, that went into the materials of these buildings. Next slide, please. So getting started in considerations when actually developing the regulations themselves. Well, you have to understand what historic and cultural resources you have through identification. And I talked about identification before under policy. Like other regulations, what's being regulated needs to be understood and identified. You can't regulate something without knowing why you're regulating it, what it is, where it's located, etc. This identification should occur before protection standards are put in place, and it's often recommended, as I cited before, through the municipal comprehensive planning process. And I want to emphasize another misunderstood item is National Register designation is a wonderful honorary designation and a wonderful way to raise awareness and education about historic resources and cultural resources, but it's often misunderstood to provide holistic protection, which of course it does not. It provides a certain level of protection, but these resource standards are really needed at the local level to provide more of that holistic protection that a community needs to preserve community character, grounded in the historic and cultural resources that are special to that community and individualized to that community. Another consideration is community participation, which I already talked about a little bit, but again, to emphasize this, the community outreach process, it yields the appropriate type and extent of historic resource protection measures. And importantly, that community participation in creating the standards and in also creating your policy, it provides a forum where the community can continue to be involved and volunteer in historic and cultural resource planning. And the historical commissions for a community can serve as the liaisons between the elected officials, the municipal staff, and then the public as well to serve in that liaison capacity. Another item that has to be considered is clear review processes, terminology, and criteria. Interpretation of ordinance provisions is already difficult enough, and it can be a regulatory and administrative challenge. So really getting at clear, consistent regulatory provisions and processes, terms and definitions. Make sure your terms in your various ordinances mean the same thing. And if they don't mean the same thing, then figure out how to either have them mean the same thing or change the term slightly so that you really have two different terms with two different meanings, so there's no confusion. And also look at administrative procedures so that there's less room for misinterpretation, and making sure there's clear administrative procedures in administering these regulations. An example of review criteria that could be used are design guidelines as part of review criteria. Design guidelines generally look at the physical environment, including architecture, setting, could get into fences, lighting, those sorts of things, how far a building is away from a road. And they can assist a municipal review of historic resource rehabilitations and alterations. They can also assist in evaluating compatibility of new construction in historic settings, and really help property owners understand and comply with regulations, because they provide clear expectations of what is or is not considered compatible with a historic resource. So a big selection that you have to make is, should you use the municipality's planning code regulations, or should you use the local historic district regulations, or should you use a combination of both to meet your preservation goals? If both are used, and a number of municipalities in Chester County do use both, then they need to be complementary. So I spoke earlier about both, but now I'm going to just speak briefly how they both work in actually the context of an ordinance setting versus how they both work in terms of what they are as enabling legislation and how they were founded as an enabling legislation. So the municipality's planning code regulations, if you choose to go that way, you'll generally see that in your zoning ordinance or your subdivision and land development ordinance as the two major types of protection, codes. Generally, you see protection on a municipal-wide basis. Sometimes you see protection in a specific area, and sometimes the protection could focus on a specific type of resource as defined. You can see protection through standards that are within the ordinance itself, for example, as natural resource standards are done, or you could see an overlay district, as in all municipalities have a floodplain overlay district. You could see regulations in that form. It's again personal preference for the municipality. And regulations, importantly, may address such things as lot area, what your building coverage is on a lot, or how much surface coverage, for example, how many driveways, etc., impervious surface coverage you can have on a lot. What are some incentives to promote preservation and adaptive reuse? What's the impact of development, new development, on historic resources? You can look at rehabilitation, review. You can look at buffering standards, how you're going to buffer or screen your historic resource from new development or vice versa. Looking at lighting standards, and then looking at demolition. Getting into the local historic district based types of regulations, it is a district-based approach, remember, where you do define boundaries of what the district is, and the resources will be regulated within those boundaries. As I said before, it's often a more compact area with historic resources in proximity to one another. Sometimes there are rural historic districts with historic resources dispersed over a larger area, still within a certain bound of a district. The regulations in these districts, nonetheless, generally speaking, and I'm making vast generalizations here in the interest of time, generally focus more on architecture and physical character. For example, specific structural changes, specific landscaping, lighting, fencing, signage, demolition. And as part of these local historic district regulations, they must have, in addition to the Historic Architectural Review Board that I mentioned before, they must have design guidelines. Whereas the municipality's planning code regulations, it would be nice if they had design guidelines, but it's not a requirement of how those regulations work. So the last item on this slide is, once all of these considerations have been covered, then your ordinance preparation, pen to paper, or I guess fingers to typing these days, begins. So ordinance preparation, whether it's the municipality's planning code or whether it's the local historic district based, includes core elements. You define your historic resources and areas where regulations apply through a list or a map. This may include historic resource identification criteria, so you know how to identify resources going forward in the future that may not yet be identified, because obviously historic resources, they age is a moving target for new buildings or new cultural sites becoming historic. And then the second major element after defining the historic resources themselves and the area is the establishing those review processes, the standards, the criterias used for resource identification, review, and any determinations. And then after all of this, you adopt the ordinance, and the adoption process is done differently for both types of enabling legislations. But nonetheless, the ordinance must be adopted by the Municipal Board of Supervisors or the Borough Council. And I will end my presentation with some closing remarks to historical commissions, because remember I said that this talk was primarily geared towards historical commissions. So tying it also back together with the theme of this webinar, Old Places Matter and celebrating cultural heritage. I'm going to speak directly to historical commissions now. You're really contributing to the quality of life in your community, including sense of place and identity. Please keep this in mind when you're doing your day-to-day historic and cultural resource work in your community, because what you're doing is really contributing to a thoughtful future for your community. Please stay aware of your role in the larger picture of municipal planning. and in a future for your municipality grounded in your community's shared history. Historical commissions are there to help preserve the features and elements of your home communities that help tell the bigger, layered story with an eye towards stewardship of cultural and historic resources and settings that are integral to sense of place and identity. Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate you listening to my talk, and thank you to the network for allowing me to present today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jeannine, for doing that condensed version of your presentation. There are 3 questions here, which we have a couple minutes, if we could just squeeze them in. Jay Byerly says, there was mention that East Whiteland changed their code. Several years ago, Coatesville changed their code to say anything built after January 1st, 1940 was not historic. Is there any way this can be reversed?
Yes, it's adopted in their code. Remember, I said a good amount of time has to be spent to identification of resources and what is and isn't a resource, and reviewing that would be a first step on setting those limitations. You want to make sure in your resource identification that it's not arbitrary, and while choosing I believe it was the 1940s date, may not have been an arbitrary decision, you want to make sure that there's no interpretation that that was an arbitrary decision. You need to have justification for why that was chosen. But yes, that can be changed through amending the code.
Thank you. The next comes from AJ Froning. He says the Kennett Square Harb ordinance suggests but does not mandate that a member of the Harb also be a member of the Planning Commission. Currently, I serve on both, and it allows me to bridge the 2 important advisory groups to Borough Council. Rob Williams has a question. He says, it is easier to understand the protections enabled in historic districts, but for overlay districts, what protections are most prevalent in Chester County beyond simply inhibiting demolition of a designated historic resource?
To make this a really simple answer, I am going to direct you to Chester County Planning Commission's website. And we can also make this available if you want. There is a matrix in our 2013 Battlefield Preservation Plan, and it literally lists the various types. I did the matrix. So it literally lists the various types of regulations that could go into a historic resource overlay. I don't know how to begin to answer that question. I'm sorry, because it's complicated and it's varied. But if you look at that matrix, if you go to chescoplanning.org, historic preservation box, campaign of 1777, Battle of Brandywine, and then you look for the 2013 Battlefield Preservation Plan, you go to the historic resources chapter, and there's a matrix in there that will explain that to you, and again, list the varied options that you have for overlays.
Thank you. There's 3 more here. We'll see how many we get in. Somebody says, how would you advise a municipality that does not recognize or, quote, certify a national registered district to remedy this, quote, oversight or omission?
So the National Register District, I assume, has stayed a National Register District and has not become a local historic district. I'm imagining that's what the person is trying to get to.
Yeah.
Well, it is possible, depending on what's more palatable. I mean, sometimes the Local Historic District Act is palatable, and sometimes the municipality's planning code regulations, for example, in zoning or subdivision and land development ordinances, are palatable. I would say the key is to start with baby steps and to look through this, do a community engagement process, community participation, have an engagement process, and figure out where the community stands on resources and how to take some small steps in preserving the National Register eligible and listed districts and sites. Many municipalities that I've worked with start with adaptive reuse incentives. Nothing about demolition, nothing about any sticks, just start with carrots and really help people with their economic vitality of their historic resources, and start in that capacity to start to have a conversation about this can be positive for your community character, and this can be positive for your pocketbook if done the right way.
Okay, thank you. 2 more here, and then anybody who needs to jump to the next session, we understand that. But if you want to stay and listen to these 2 answers, you could do that. Lynn Luft says, how can prevention by demolition by neglect be enforced?
That is a very difficult one.
Okay.
I think talking to Schuylkill Township might be a good idea, because in recent years, they were successful in going through a process of litigation on demolition by neglect, is my understanding. And so how they approach that would be maybe a good standard, but it is very difficult. And I think trying to get out in front of things, some municipalities I've worked with actually keep a at-risk list similar to Preservation Pennsylvania, and they are constantly making contacts with landowners. It's not a be-all end-all, but it's a constant conversation with landowners, and you're not going to win them all, but it's at least an engagement process. But definitely look into the Schuylkill Township situation and how that went.
Thank you. And the last question, and maybe this can lead into a final question. The question is, can you elaborate on the Historic Architect Review Board requirement? And I think I would extend that to just say, maybe Jeannine, can you tell us, what is a good resource for historical commissions? Are you a resource, and how do people get in touch with you or the right person?
Well, I will give you my email address. And if you see on the bottom of this slide, and can you scroll back to the very first slide? Do you mind?
Sure.
The very first slide, on the bottom of the first slide, there are 2 web links, and those are web links to our website, but also much more information than I just gave you on both of these tools, including some of the items you're talking about, local historic districts, overlays, HARBs. And I think that might be a good resource, but I'll just give you my email and we can talk about this maybe offline. It's J Speirs, and that's JSPEIRS at chesco.org. And you're welcome to reach out to me, and we could continue the conversation about that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeannine, for this excellent presentation. And I'm just going to wrap it up with some final comments and then close the meeting. Okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience.
Yes, and thank you. We appreciate it. So I will just say thank you so much to all the people who joined us for tuning in to the second program in the CCHPN virtual spring workshop lineup. Special thanks to Jeannine Speirs of the Chester County Planning Commission for providing us with an exceptional presentation on preservation, planning, and protection standards. Like the National Trust, the Chester County Historic Preservation Network is working to preserve our historic resources for ourselves, each other, and our future together. Please visit our website, cchpn.org, for information, events, membership, and donations. The 1030 CCHPN Spring Workshop Program, Diversity, Historic Preservation with Bertha Jackman and Tanya Thames Taylor, is starting now. Click the link you receive for the 1030 program to join this third presentation in our series. Have a wonderful weekend, and remember, old places matter. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.